Here we go. So right, we're back again Friday, a little bit earlier than usual with Right Aligned, coming all the way from Australia, which is our first time, which is quite mind blowing really. And I've got a cup of tea, and James has got a glass of wine, which is slightly enviable. Our end quite shortly. For everybody that's just tuning in and anybody that hasn't watched recently, we've just started a little partnership with the Design Calendar, which is a great resource for online and physical events. Now we're getting more of those coming up. If anybody wants to check them out, there's a link in the feed. And if anyone's got any questions for James, please drop them in, and we'll ask them either throughout or at the end, just so we can bookmark this nicely with a few questions if anybody has them. But James, while I'm letting people in, obviously it's great to see you this morning. If you can, or this evening at your end, if you don't mind taking us back to as far back as you can remember, really, it's when creativity really first played a part in your life, and how that really manifested itself into potentially into education, into a career. Guide us through those early phases, if that's possible.
Yeah, of course. So I obviously I live in Sydney. I live in Australia, but I'm born in the UK and born in the northeast of England. And my mum and dad were kind of really creative people in their own right. My dad was a teacher, and in his spare time, one of his passions was photography, and the other was music. And so those kind of links and bonds between visual and audio experiences were built up really early with me. He is a fantastic guitar player and is a phenomenal photographer. And my mum, for as long as I can remember, has always been a yoga teacher. She's been a yoga teacher for about 40 years. And so, whilst you wouldn't kind of necessarily term it the creative arts and creative fields, there is something about the way in which you think about organizing a body and emotions and movements, which is that grounding kind of really set me up to think about the way in which I could kind of engage the world around me. At one point I wanted to be an architect, because I was really into kind of spatial design and the world around us, but then I realized that you had to study for an absolute age, and so that quickly swerved me away from that. I was fascinated by cars. So every summer when me and my brother were children, my dad would take us to the Birmingham NEC for there's like a car show every year, and I was obsessed with the concept cars. So you'd see, these like insane futuristic cars from kind of Ford or even like Caterpillar that would look like little moon robots, and actually don't look too dissimilar to things like the Teslas that are now starting to turn up, and the Cybertruck and stuff like that. And so I was obsessed with that. I used to collect car magazines, cut the pictures out, paste them back into like sugar paper books, and collect all that stuff. So I wanted to be an auto designer for a while, and then that sort of fizzled. And then I got really interested in language during my sixth form college. So I went to sixth form in York, and for a year I wanted to be a journalist for some reason. I can't remember what sent me down that, but I was in love with language, and I studied English language and English literature. And then ultimately, my foundation course, I did a foundation which took me through kind of fine art, product design, graphic design, sculpture, and maybe architecture as foundations, or like spatial design. And I just fell in love with graphic design. And it was really because, as you can see in the background, I've got a set of decks and a whole lot of vinyl. I'm passionate about music. I love music, and I love how it connects back to that point, with my dad. It connects the visual and sonic experience, and it connects into culture as well. I've always been fascinated how creativity taps into the semiotics of the world around us, and like that cultural piece. And so I was really getting into DJing and music and records and vinyls at that time, when I was kind of around my foundation course. And all of a sudden I could see something in the world which I loved, which I could lay a hand on and say, this is something which kind of moves me and that I emote with. But I could also build a a passion, a job, not a career, because you don't think about a career when you're 16, but a job around it. I could do this, and I could do this in the world. And so that was it. That was it, right? Okay, I can be a graphic designer. I want to design record sleeves. I was really into like Designers Republic and Intro and like all these agencies that were doing music work at the time, Signosis and stuff like that. And so ultimately that took me to Liverpool John Moores, which is where I did my degree. 3 years there, which was brilliant. Liverpool was at this kind of moment where it had just been awarded the capital of culture, and so it was really kind of coming out of a time when it was, kind of a bit left behind. Manchester had been redeveloped because of the Arndale bombings in, what would it have been, like the 90s maybe, and they had it was quite glittering again, and Liverpool was starting to get on its feet and build this motion. And so yeah, those 3 years were absolutely transformational. And to that point on like music and visual culture, I spent a significant amount of that time at Chibuku, which was this incredible club there, which blended, like it was one of those first clubs in the UK where it was like you could go and see like breaks and grime and drum and bass and techno and house, and like all this diversity in different rooms under one banner. And yeah, that ultimately kind of gave me my first taste and my first steps, I suppose.
What was the timeline there, roughly, James? For Liverpool?
So I was at John Moores in 2005 to 2008. Okay. Yeah.
So I suppose obviously things like Hacienda, Factory Records, Acid House, that was obviously all been and gone, but the remnants of that was still strong in that visual culture.
Yeah, 100%. And I think Liverpool's obviously always had a very storied history with places like Cream and kind of being part of that. And yeah, it was Hacienda, Factory, all that stuff had kind of passed me by. I was far too young, but I could see stuff in that, whether it was the work that was done for Hacienda or Factory Records, like all the cover work, or like stuff that Designers Republic were doing for Warp. Like Warp was a huge influence on me. I did my whole final dissertation on record sleeve design, but I basically used it as an excuse to go and just talk to designers at record businesses. So I went and talked to like someone at Big Dada. I went and talked to someone at Warp Records. I managed to talk to Non-Format because they were doing a load of stuff for, oh God, what was the record label? It's like Lo-Fi or something. And then I ended up talking to, there was a record label which I was really into called Temper, which was connected to a nightclub in London called Rinse and Rinse FM, and an agency that does all the work called Give Up Art, run by a guy called Stu Hammersley. And so I managed to track him down, managed to like interview him for my dissertation. And then I managed to somehow convince him to give me my first placement out of university. And that kind of connection ultimately set me up for kind of everything afterwards.
What was that steps like after that then? So did you go into an agency with it, or working directly in house with the label?
You're going off the homework.
No, so when I for my dissertation, I basically just kind of reached out to everyone and started speaking to people. Stu, his agency, they do a lot of stuff around kind of music and club nights, and for me that was it was everything that I wanted to do at that point. So I started doing an internship with him, and then I did an internship with another agency in London, another agency, and sort of slept on friends' sofas for months at a time, and called in some real favors from friends of my parents, and just kind of sort of bummed around London for a few months trying to get a taste of a bit of everything.
So was there anything in mind that you got a master planner, so to speak? Was it branding? Was it purely music label? Was it
at that time my master plan was definitely I want to design record sleeves. My master plan was like, I want to design record sleeves, I want to work in music. These are two things I love. I love this visual bit and I love this sonic bit. And I soon it was really interesting because I worked at Stu for a little bit and did a few sleeves, which was like dream come true. And massive credit to him for kind of helping me and nurturing me through that. I then realized that I kind of wanted to do something more, that I wanted something beyond the visual piece to it. And I think maybe that's going back to, you know, kind of connecting back to that thought when I was in sixth form, and I really wanted to be a journalist. Like, all that was just about, I love to learn about things, and I love to, you know, I'm a voracious reader of the news and like politics and opinion pieces, and I just want to know more about the world around me. And I didn't really know that that's what branding was. It was essentially like investigating the world around you and then building visual outcomes and systems to do that. So I was kind of still in that world of, you know, I want to work in and around music and culture and all that stuff and things that I know and love. And so ultimately that led me to work at Studio Output. So all through university, I was head over heels in love with the work that Studio Output did, and especially the work that they did for Sony PlayStation and the work they did for Ministry of Sound. And it was just like this breath of fresh air. Every month, I think, they were kind of putting out promotion work for Ministry of Sound's nightclub. And it was like nothing that had gone before mattered, and anything was up for grabs. And that just like set me alive. I was like, I want to go work for these guys. And so after about a year of interning, I saw a junior job come up. I applied for it. I got a 2-day trial for a junior job at their studio in Nottingham. And I'd never been to Nottingham. So I went to Nottingham, spent 2 days there working with the team, and I got the job. And I sort of packed up everything and moved straight to Nottingham the week after. And that was like the first sort of 3.5 years. I was working with those guys in Notts.
Right. So they specialised in cultural design? Was it more than anything, or more sort of music driven, or was it more multidisciplinary?
It was a lot of stuff. So it was everything from, like, the BBC was a big client, so we were doing a lot of stuff for BBC and Radio 1 and like Radio 1 Big Weekend, which was a festival that they would run every summer. So we do things like the brands for those festivals and those campaigns. A lot of stuff for Sony PlayStation. So we were doing pieces like brands for new hardware products or brands for games. A lot of the Ministry of Sound stuff and kind of music work and culture, but then also things like Arts Council England. So that was a client, and also picture and piano. So I did a lot of time designing menus.
I mean, there's a heavy focus on cultural output, though, isn't there, in terms of picture and piano, maybe a bit more hospitality driven, but the other stuff is, you know, you've still got a foot in the music as well as the, you know, the popular culture as well as alternative cultures. But the Ministry, Ministry of Sound was something then that really just continued that spark in you because of the love of that music and the love of that scene.
Yeah, it was just, it was just knowing that you can, I think there's something really, like, you know, the more I think about it, I think there's something actually really lovely about understanding that you can do a job which allows you to celebrate a bit of the thing that you love outside of that job, you know. So, and for me at that time, it was, I love what this kind of brand, culture, music signifies, speaks to, and I get the opportunity to kind of bring something that I can do a little bit, like, you know, I can do a bit of design, a bit of creativity. I get to bring a bit of that to it as well.
So were you stepping into not just the creative? Was there a lot more involvement in things like strategy, or much more in, you know, a lot more?
No, not really at that time. Like through my kind of first 3.5 years at Output, you know, we had a studio in Nottingham, and there was like 6 of us there, and that was great because it was like I was the junior designer, and I got to work with my design director Johanna, who is now creative director and partner in the studio in London, Rob, who's one of the founders, and Dan, and I got to just like get loads of time from incredible people and just soak it up. And we didn't do a lot of like really complex strategy at that point. It had kind of been born from an agency, you know, Output had been born from that world of doing kind of work for music and arts and culture, and it had started to grow and evolve. There was our team in Nottingham, which was about 7 people, and then there was a team in London, which was probably about 15, 16, I think at the time. And yeah, you know, after kind of 3.5 years, whilst I hadn't necessarily been doing a lot of that strategic work, what I had been doing is I was getting really passionate and interested in motion design, in 3D and animation. So I started teaching myself Cinema 4D, and starting to kind of peel a lot of that work off, which is ultimately what started to prompt me to think about, I kind of want to go and try something else. I want to go and, I want to go like, what's next? I've done 3.5 years and start thinking about that next move.
And what was those steps after that? What did that look like?
Yeah, so after that, I would have been 26. Yeah, so I started to get that itch, and Nottingham's an incredible place. It's hands down the cheapest place I've ever lived. I think we had a 5-bed townhouse, and I was probably paying about 250 quid a month on rent. It was obscene, and cheap pints and a great time. So good place to live as a junior designer. But yeah, I started getting like itchy feet, and I was like, okay, maybe it's time to go do the London thing. I'd purposefully sort of swerved that for a few years because there's this isn't why, but there's a really great phrase which Designers Republic used to use, which was north of nowhere, because they're based in Sheffield, and it was a bit of a like middle finger to the sort of London centricity of design, and saying, you know what, we're our own thing. We don't have to be in London to do great work. And I'd kind of taken that attitude to heart for a few years. But then I was getting a bit itchy, and I was like, okay, what is it next? Maybe I'm going to hop ship and go down to London. And I saw that Design Studio were looking for digital designers. They'd put it out on Twitter, and I wasn't a digital designer by any means or any mark. And so I popped the creative director a note at the time and said, hey, look, this isn't me, but I'd love a chat. And he said, yep, come on down. Had an interview, had a chat with them, and yeah, a couple of weeks later they offered me a job. And once again, I was packing all my life up and moving somewhere very quickly, and somewhere I'd never lived before, and I was down to London.
Did that feel like, I mean, sort of saying it now, like going to Nottingham and then just going to London, it sounds quite a sort of, quite a simple, sort of easy thing to do, but it's not, from an emotional perspective or connections or the friendships you built and moving to somewhere completely new. People that are thinking about doing that, what does that really look like in real terms? Is that just you've got to just go and embrace it and just dive in, or is that you have to weigh up a lot of options? What would it look like for you in real terms?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was kind of reflecting on something around this the other day and I think this is something which I've got in my character, which is I'm quite happy to just like pull the ripcord and go somewhere else. It was easy, it was logistically a bit tricky because I had to find a house, move all my stuff, and do that in about the space of a week, which isn't great. No one likes house hunting, especially when you don't live in a city that you're trying to hunt for a house in. But yeah, the guys at Output were brilliant. They kind of saw me off in style, and kind of really recognized that this is the right time for me, and probably the right time for them to kind of start that junior journey again, and maybe find someone to grow. And yeah, it was brilliant. And I think I particularly enjoyed it because I'd had 3 years in an agency where I could try lots and lots of different things and kind of flex lots of different skills in a really supportive space. And now I had an opportunity to go and kind of bring all of that difference into like Design Studio at that time. Were our primary client was Nokia, and it was great. We were doing like brand films, photo shoots, retail experiences, like all this, like everything for Nokia, so much stuff. And all of a sudden, all of my like diverse experience was like super valuable because I could create things in 3D, I could direct things, I could think how things moved in motion. Like it wasn't, and then that started to click for me. I was like, oh, that's what branding is. It's one thing that expresses itself in lots of different ways across lots of different places. Yeah, it was wild. It was fun. I was 26, so nothing really mattered.
In case you would recommend, just embrace it, go for it, dive in.
100%. You can always go home. You can always go home.
Do you think we have a tendency? I think us as creatives or professionals have a tendency, just you find comfort in somewhere and you sort of end up being there for 20 years before you know it, and it's too late to turn back. Is that there is some sort of technology in that.
Yeah, look, yeah, look, there's value in that comfort, like comfort, or like, you know, there's value in being able to dig deeper and kind of spend time to like investigate a place and like hone your practice. You know, I'm 35 now, so I'm only like 13, 14 years into a career. Like, hopefully I've got a long time left, and I'm not just going to be put out to pasture at some point. So, you know, you've got to get comfy with staying at a couple of places for a bit of time. You can't leap around all the time. But yeah, 100% do it. Like, you know, I kind of moved to Australia on a bit of a whim, and that was 5 years ago. Probably move somewhere else at some point. You know, I think it's one of the real blessings of what we do is it is needed, it's necessary, and it's applicable in so many parts of the world.
Yeah. So just going back to when you first started Design Studio, what did that look like then compared to what we see of it, you know, as you know, quite a big organisation that's creating, you know, incredible work regularly from where I sit. But what was that like when you first stepped into that? Was it a different beast then?
Yeah, totally different beast, and it's gone through like, there's been like several phases, and you know, I've been there for a lot of it, and I've not been there for some of it as well. So when I first joined, which would have been end of 2012, we were about 30 people in London, just above Old Street Roundabout, just off City Road, and like Nokia was our main client. So we were doing, you know, if you can imagine, enough work to keep 30 people busy from one client. So that's like a shit ton of work. We were creating incredible 3D films for products, looking at kind of retail experiences, sort of owning the whole master brand, campaign shoots. So like real diversity and stretch across one client. And then, you know, that's obviously a precarious place for any business to sit with all of your kind of financial eggs in one basket, as it was. And so over the following years, we kind of set a path to start to reduce that risk and mitigate that risk and bring in new clients and really become the branding agency that we were and wanted to be and wanted to be known as. Yeah, and that started with, you know, some of our most famous pieces of work, you know, Airbnb, Premier League, Logitech, Deliveroo, those kind of first few years setting the groundwork with those. And over time, it's developed into a business with 3 thriving and growing offices around the world, with nearly 100 people as part of the business, with really diverse and differentiated skill sets, everything from strategists and writers to digital designers and motion designers. Yeah, and now it is what you kind of see it is, which is, like you say, you know, really large and established branding agency working all around the world on all kinds of interesting stuff.
So do the 4 individual sites, do you say you guys in Australia, obviously you deal with a wide region, don't you? It's not just Australia, you know, further the APAC, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did you work entirely independently from, is London classified as still the head office, so to speak?
I mean, I suppose you could say that, like it was, you know, we were founded in London, and Ben and Paul, who are the founders, are both kind of living in the UK still. But I don't know, it's not head office in the sense that it's like we report into, there's a kind of reporting line in that sense. You know, we have 3 studios, so there's New York, London, and Sydney. And between us, we all look after different regions. So Sydney looks after all of Asia Pacific. You know, about 80 to 90% of our work isn't within Australia. It's in China, Hong Kong, Korea, Thailand, Singapore. You know, you look at that kind of block and organization of countries that makes Asia Pacific, which can stretch as far west as India and as far east as kind of Japan, if you're sort of getting creative. All of that sits within about a kind of -5 or +3 or 4 hour time zone of us in Sydney, which means all of a sudden you've got the potential to work with markets which have billions of people, like billions, and some of the most dynamic and interesting countries in the world, and some of the most kind of ambitious brands, which is really interesting. And then London, obviously looks after Europe, EMEA, and the UK. And then New York kind of sits for North America, LATAM, and Canada. And yeah, we are one business and sort of one studio with kind of 3 locations, but it's very much about recognizing the sort of strengths and the differences that we all have. I think our expertise here, and one of the things that we've developed a really strong reputation for within our group, but also kind of outside over the past couple of years, is working with fintech businesses. And part of that is the nature of some of those countries and the businesses that are coming out of it. London's doing a lot of work in esports. New York's working with some really exciting tech cos and scale up. So yeah, there's not really a like we're answering to them kind of structure.
So is it, so in that respect, then you work as an independent, completely independent sort of studio that serves a different part of the world. It just happens to have the same name. So is there a process that runs across the whole group, or do you left to use devices to find your own clients to sort of serve them in your own?
So I mean, there's like operational and organizational consistency. So we have a lot of functions that sit within our London studio. So things like finance, HR, all that stuff that services all 3 studios, because it's there are efficiencies that you make when you kind of scale a business. And obviously the leadership, so group CEO and COO sit in London, founders sit in London. But yeah, in terms of kind of processes, so obviously I spent about 4 years in the London studio before I moved to Australia and I opened up the studio here. And some of what we do here I carry from my kind of time there, and like the spirit and energy of the way that we work. But some of it's also, you've got to adapt your process when you're working with like we over the past year we've been working with kind of one of the biggest tech companies in China, and probably the biggest tech companies in the world. And the way that you work with them versus working with, a scale up from Berlin or an enterprise business in New York or Chicago has to change, has to flex, whether that's that cultural consideration, that organizational consideration, the project type, So there are kind of, consistencies and sort of foundations that probably carry across studio more as a I don't know, like the spirit of the way that we work, that supports us to do the kind of work that we want to do. But yeah, we all kind of get our own clients, look after each region as well.
Yeah, when I spoke to James at Koto as part of this series, I found it really interesting because they've got 3 global offices, a little bit more closer to home than you guys, but the way that they adapted to like the culture of those places, so they really ingrained themselves. So they were really like 3 independent businesses basically, but they all fell under the same name. I really like that concept that their Berlin office, that it's very much driven about the people of that region, the sort of the culture of the the place, the heritage, all of those sorts of things, and the way that they then communicated with potential clients was all very much more sympathetic. It wasn't just sort of marauding English business, just sort of dominating and telling people what they need to have. It was very much about understanding and being sympathetic to that. So that was quite an interesting way of doing it, quite an interesting spin. And I presume that's sort of what.
Yeah, 100%. We're working in South Korea at the moment, which I was really lucky to go up to Seoul a couple of years ago when we could all travel a lot more. And it's a fascinating place, but it's also like corporate culture in South Korea is extremely hierarchical, very hierarchical, and I think patriarchal as well. And so what you tend to find as someone who doesn't have cultural connection to that country or kind of that organization is that you are potentially viewed more as a supplier, and that you are kind of dealing with people who sort of manage that relationship with external partners. So they, you kind of work with them, and then they go up and kind of work with leadership, and then sort of things sort of go in and go up and come back out to you. Whereas the way that we always work and like to work and know delivers greater results is to work with C-suite leadership, the people who are making the decisions about the organization, its future, understand its challenges, the real kind of gritty detail of what it's going to take to take that business forward in the direction that they want. But sometimes in some countries and some cultures, because of bigger cultural context, you just don't get that kind of relationship and that access, and you've got to come to terms with it and then work to create ways to mitigate it and create the outcome which you know is possible through kind of different means and methods.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I mean, it's something that I don't really hear much spoken about, to be fair. You know, that sort of that leap from being small independent to sort of, you know, taking the plunge into different parts of the world and having to really sort of you know, be very sympathetic to what, you know, the rest of the world expects, not just what we think. You know, the way that we do things in the UK is very different to the way most people do things, and it's, you know, it's something that I think needs to be really addressed.
And I think I do think that is only more amplified through like the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asian region. You know, I think Europe, because of like, you know, big socio-political projects like the European Union, is more culturally in tune or like homogeneous with the rest of it, whereas the difference between Thailand, Vietnam and Singapore and South Korea and Myanmar and Cambodia is radically different, like ginormous difference in, you know, socio-economic understandings, of ambitions to be extremely nationally recognized or globally recognized, you know, the way that they think about digital experiences, the way that they think about brands. So it's actually, I think it's actually one of my favorite things about the work that we get to do from here in Sydney is, you know, I get to go and have a conversation with, like, we're working with a client in Taiwan at the moment, and the conversations with them versus the conversations with our clients in China or South Korea, radically different, and the kind of sensitivities and considerations you need to bring to that change every time.
That must in itself push you creatively, you know, just from how the project works, you know, the nuances within that, and the, you know, the language or the sort of approach that you take. That must be, I imagine, really exciting.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And it's actually, I was chatting to someone about this the other night, and I think one of the things which I'm yet to determine, and I really want to kind of come to understand is like, what is there an Australian aesthetic for design, or, you know, a Vietnamese aesthetic for design, or Korean aesthetic for design, like coming to understand those visual cultures and those cultures and the visual representations that they take out to the world. Because, you know, so much of what is considered good design essentially comes from like a really Eurocentric point of view. Swiss modernism set the standard, and we're all here to kind of point ourselves towards that. You know, it's this kind of typography, and it's set in this kind of way because it, you know, evokes these feelings, where design is the you know, the kind of coal face of culture of a community or a country or a people or a point of view. And we can't expect every culture to just use the same tools and say, oh yeah, we're all going to like represent ourselves in the world through like Swiss modernism, and that's relevant to us as it was to the Swiss. No, that's horseshit. And so, like, actually coming to understand what is good design in China, and culturally what is respected, and, you know, even like digging right down into kind of like cultural cues and notes, like auspicious colors or forms. You know, something that we come up against, which is, or not up against, which come into contact with, which is really interesting, is you'll find in a lot of Chinese organizations of a certain scale is that they'll have a feng shui specialist, and they'll be brought in to talk about the feng shui of certain elements of that brand, that product, that physical space. There's a really great story about how if you look at Hong Kong's sort of harborside skyline, all the buildings on that skyline were built with feng shui specialists who were kind of part of the construction of those buildings and the architects. And then there was one building which is constructed, which is, I think it's the Central Bank of China. I can't remember. It might be the British consulate. And that one is like, they ignored feng shui when they built it. It's got these giant spikes on it, which are really bad vibes. And it was pointing, it had like this thing where it was pointing at the HSBC building, which if anyone's ever seen it, it's a Norman Foster building in Hong Kong. It's amazing. It's kind of like one of those ones where it's the sort of insides outside thing. It's got this lattice up the outside. And so what HSBC did was brought in a feng shui specialist, and they built, go and Google this, they built feng shui cannons onto the top of the building, which are designed to like blast the bad vibes away from the tower. And I'm just like, you know what, that is A, fascinating, but also just super useful and super interesting to start to understand like the way in which people think about the impact and relationship of the like visual world around them and its kind of emotional state.
So those cultural references in those areas that you service, do they even apply to things such as the way that you market a brand or the copywriting?
Yeah, 100%. You know, like you could have a conversation, like I was having a conversation with someone a few weeks ago about the forms and colors of a logo, which were, you know, deemed to be more auspicious because we're trying to talk to this kind of audience who have these deep-seated cultural beliefs and expectations. And so it's really cool because it's, you know, it's like with every good brief or every good challenge, there's kind of things to work within, work around, push against, respect, bring in, amplify. Like, yeah, it's super interesting, like coming at it from a outsider's point of view.
Always makes me wonder for how long have we got it wrong in this country when people use things like dragons and the color red? Is it, you know, for Chinese New Year, it's really naively done.
It's just lazy. It's just like the lazy like first thing, and that comes from, you know, we are, you know, in the UK, and I can like talk to my own experience, but like, yeah, I wasn't taught anything about Asia and like the diversity and difference of all of those countries and those people and experiences in school or college. You know, it's like it's a big lump of land mass and, you know, several billion people over here that is just sort of determined by one thing, which is Asia, you know, and like, you know, and that's kind of coming into this role and coming into this region and working in these countries, like the difference and diversity of those conversations and relationships that you have with those clients. Like we were doing some work in the Philippines a couple of years ago, and for a kind of big e-com brand, and it was fascinating because we were having these conversations about like strategy and the proposition and the core thought, and, you know, it was all bouncing along really well, and we were like, yep, great, this is it, it's definitely this. The client was loving it. And then a few weeks later, they came back to us and they were like, well, you know, actually, we're not really sure. We're not really sure that this is the right idea. And we were kind of taken aback because through this whole thing, it had all been very positive, very affirming that we were really hitting the mark on this. And I think what we came to understand was that in this relationship with these individuals and in certain parts of Philippine culture, there is there's a bit of like relationship to build before you can have kind of confronting or challenging conversations. And so, you know, we were having to go a certain distance before they felt that they could actually challenge us and kind of bring that negative, challenging feedback back to us. You know, it was very much about, they were kind of very positive and effusive about the work, and it was, you know, it's all moving along really nicely. So yeah, it's working here over the past 5 years has taught me huge amounts. I've still got a shit ton to learn, but it started to really kind of crack the door open for me.
Right, yeah, that sounds fascinating. I think, again, until you sort of dive into those worlds, you never really fully understand it, will you? So it's, again, there's testament to that jumping ship and going other places and experiencing new worlds. Not in London or Australia. It's definitely worth doing, isn't it? Just to experience different places. What I wanted to talk to you, James, I'm sure you spoke about this a billion times, but it's the Airbnb project. Until I saw that video on your website a long time ago, I never really ever experienced or even knew people went to that length in branding or design. I thought, you know, my experiences have been a lot smaller and a lot shallower than that. I'm fascinated to know how that sort of the origins of that, how that started, how you started to pin. It sounds quite obvious now when you see the video and you think, of course, why wouldn't you set up a bedroom in an office or go around the world and experience all these different, you know, what the client offers? But how did that, were you part of that process, that whole branding exercise?
Yeah, so I was in the London studio around that time, and I think there's a couple of things which come into play there. Like it was like the first big piece of branding work that had come in for this studio. You know, it came in as a pitch, as a creative pitch, and I think one thing which is really core to Design Studio, and you know, I think we have, you know, you've got a kind of responsibility to remind yourself of every now and again, is creativity is really fucking powerful. And if you show someone like that level of effort and passion and energy in whatever you do, and take a real step into their world, it yields results. And so, you know, for the pitch, we set the studio up as a listing. Like we turned the whole end of the studio into a bedroom. We listed it on Airbnb. We printed this giant listing thing. And it was like, you know, rent a room in where is it? Farringdon. Rent a room in Farringdon. Here's all the details of the listing. We brought basically everyone brought all their nice like design knickknacks into the studio. You know, we dressed the studio up. And yeah, you know, it changed everything, because, you know, I know there were businesses I think there was about 20 studios were asked to pitch. There were studios in San Francisco who were asked to pitch for the Airbnb job, and Airbnb are headquartered in San Francisco. And those teams didn't even go to their office. They just like took a Skype call. And it's a bit like, you know, this is potentially, you know, one of the biggest opportunities this studio will ever have. What are you going to do to set yourself apart and stand apart? And I think, you know, going the extra mile in a pitch, telling a story, and like really pushing yourself to take a step into a client's world is super powerful. Like, not even just from like a work point of view, but from a personal point of view. It is like, that's empathy. It's like, hey, I get you.
Unlike taking an online conference call, or unlike just sort of sending over a PDF deck, what was the aim of that? Did you want to just understand what a customer of theirs felt like? Did you want to understand what somebody that hosted rooms felt like? Was it just about purely immersing yourselves in their world so that you can understand them better?
Yeah. So we did that for the pitch. We like built a listing for the pitch, because they came to London, Brian and Joe, I think it was, or maybe it was Brian and Nate. And you know, that was, I think for them, that was like incredibly powerful. It's just like, hey, these guys get us, they get our world, they want to be part of this. I think that there is a really unique set of circumstances around Airbnb, and you know, part of it is that Joe and Brian are both designers. They studied at RISD in the States, and you know, having people at the top of an organization who understand the power of creativity and creative thinking shouldn't be underestimated. You know, not every business, barely any business is Airbnb. You know, it's kind of a real unique set of circumstances. And yeah, so once the pitch was won, we sent 4 people to about 12 countries over the space of a week to essentially do like market research, you know, meet teams, meet hosts, meet guests, understand what it was like to stay in a place in Bali or a place in Berlin, understand what it was like to work for Airbnb in Tokyo or London or San Francisco or New York, because, you know, whilst headquarters for them was San Francisco, they were building teams all around the world. And it's really important when you build a brand for an organization that you understand how it stands up and how it represents itself at the kind of edges of the bell curve. So, you know, for those who are furthest away from San Francisco and kind of least connected to that, you know, startup, scale up, exciting business vibe, how did this bring them into the fold? Bring them into that as well.
I think that's so important in terms of the sense that ultimately you're doing a rebrand, weren't you? So to a lot of people, that's, you know, a fancy guideline book and you know, a number of other assets, but to sort of put yourself in that position, I think it's something that so many people don't do. And this is a big scale version compared to what a lot of us work on, you know, a lot smaller. But it's still really important just to sort of take that time to see from the culture, see from behind.
Scale doesn't matter. Scale doesn't matter. Empathy. Like if you can show someone that you get their world and that you understand their problems and that you are in it together, like that buys like permission. It, buys trust.
Yeah, I think
They see that you get them.
That emotive sort of side, I think a lot of us are trying to aim for, aren't we?
Yeah.
Sort of, you truly connect on a different, a human level, which makes people buy things for the right reason, not just because it's a product or not just a commodity. It's something that's going to change their world, isn't it? And that's really, really strong. So from that phase to starting to deliver visuals, what was that look like? That was quite a long time, wasn't it? According to the video, there was a lot of rounds of revisions and
look, every project most projects that we undertake, generally run between kind of 12 and 20, if not more, weeks. And so you're kind of going through lots of phases of going very broad, going very narrow, going very broad, going very narrow, going very broad, and kind of trying to understand the potential reach and personality of an entire brand, but then thinking about the craft and look and feel of certain aspects and components. And it changes for every client. We're working with teams that you kind of work with for a year to kind of build the brand, bring them onto the brand, teach those teams. And then we do pieces where it's 3-4 months and it's a really short, fast sprint and smash. And sometimes that depends upon that scope and that project, the ambition of the organization, the capability of the teams, the challenge at hand. All of those variables play a role in depending how that project ultimately shapes up.
Oh, brilliant. I'm very conscious of the time change. It's skipped by again. I say this every week. It's very, very quick. I just one thing I would like to, I know a lot of people that have been to Australia to study and have worked there for short periods just to, to find themselves and to sort of experience something new. What's sort of design and the creative sort of scene community like as a whole in that part of the world? Is that growing? Is it thriving? Is there a lot of opportunities? Is it sort of going in the right direction?
Yes, it's really interesting. I feel like at the moment it's going through a really interesting period. Well, I think historically Australia's had a really strong design culture and sensibility. I think strangely it has been, quite kind of, as I mentioned about the sort of Eurocentrism, there's been like a connection to kind of Swiss modernism, and historically it's been kind of in and around that world. Over the past decades, there's been loads of great studios that have done incredible work, and some of them have come and some of them have gone. I think there's historically been a bit of a kind of elastic nature to the industry here, where teams might scale up and kind of hit 70 people, and then they'll lose key clients and it'll drop right back down again. And part of that is, Australia is a huge landmass. Like, it is ginormous. I mean, it's 6 hours to fly to the other side in Perth, but there's only 25 million people here. It's not a kind of densely populated country. And so that means that there's, in certain industries, there's a few key players, and if you are, as an agency, dependent upon clients within the country, there's a finite number and a finite spend that they're going to make, which is, I think, where we've purposefully tried to sort of circumnavigate that and just say, let's focus on Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific. But I think it's a really interesting point at the moment, and for a number of reasons. There's loads of great agencies here who've been here for a while. There's a phenomenal business who I definitely think you should check out, called MASH, run by a guy he's actually called James Brown, and he does incredible work. He does amazing work for like restaurants and spatial pieces. There's a amazing restaurant in Bali called Mexicola, and the story goes that he basically took a shipping container to Mexico, filled it up with ephemera and like interesting things, and then shipped it back to Bali to kind of populate this space. There's a brilliant agency over in Melbourne called Fabio Ongorato, who do beautiful work for kind of arts and culture. And also what's happening at the moment is it feels like there's a new wave of kind of international or multinational agencies opening up. So Base, the Belgian agency, have opened here. Mucho, the Spanish agency, have opened here. Future Deluxe, the amazing like 3D and motion agency, have opened up here. We've been here a few years. There's a couple of others who are kind of round the way as well. And so it feels like there's this really nice inflection point where, you know, the work and the projects and the attention has moved away from sort of traditional kind of old school agencies like the big sort of WPPs and Omnicom style agencies to like interesting, ambitious independence. And, you know, as we were talking about at the start, Chris, you know, it doesn't matter where you are now. You know, we are on the doorstep of billions of people in dozens of countries across that region. And I think that's become really clear that you can have a great career living in a you know, lovely place, doing awesome work, working for super interesting clients. And so, yeah, it definitely feels like a time where there's a bit of flux going on. And that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think always that sort of nervous disruption and, you know, not knowing what's going on, that's always a real sort of exciting part, isn't it? If you already understand what it is, then you past it, sort of, you know, it's been and gone, isn't it? It's sort of like that being in the, you know, in the sort of the infancy of it is what really exciting, and, you know, it's great to hear. So, you know, the future sounds extremely promising, but by the sounds of it, we might see you back in the UK within a couple of years and keep on you traveling, going all around the world. And
yeah, who knows? Might ping pong back to the UK at some point. You know, might go somewhere else. I think, you know, we're really fortunate that in this industry, in and around this industry, it's a really easy job to take anywhere in the world. You know, whether that's going to working for a big organization or a little studio or setting up for yourself, like, people need great creatives and you know, really kind of ambitious people who are going to help organizations think differently. So yeah, who knows, man? Who knows?
Having that agility in business as well as individually, that's really important, isn't it? To sort of, you know, to keep at the head of the curve and, you know, keep on producing the best work for, you know, not just for modern reasons of being contemporary. It's just being able to be flexible and adaptable is really important.
Yeah, definitely. It's, you know, it's the thing that, like, if I think back to my time at Studio Output when I was kind of starting to learn motion and 3D, it was because I don't think of myself as a particularly good designer, but I can think really visually, I can think really conceptually, and I can kind of link that to strategic and like organizational ambition. I've also got a bit of a magpie memory, so I can like pull things from some conversation at some point. And I think branding's a really nice place because it's where people who don't fit in other places can find a really good home and actually make what makes them different, make them kind of powerful and unique and interesting, because as need more people with difference and diversity and curiosity and diverse skills. Like it's such an interesting, it's a team sport.
Yeah,
I think graphic design is probably more of an individual pursuit, or can be an individual pursuit, whereas branding is really about seeing something from all angles, and you need lots of people with lots of different points of view to do so. Yeah,
sounds an incredible place to leave it, James. I think it's a good way to bookmark the session. I can let you crack on with your weekend.
Yeah, going to top the wine up, I think.
9 hours and counting at our end. It's been brilliant. I really appreciate your time, James, especially especially being after a long week.
No trouble at all. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope everyone's hopefully got something from it. And yeah, if anyone wants to have a chat and kind of follow up afterwards, find me on LinkedIn, James Duru. Drop me a note. Always love having a natter with interesting people.
Yeah, superb. Yeah, and where's the best place to find just Design Studio, James? I know it's quite obvious name, but just in case anybody's looking for it.
Yeah, design.studio is our website, so you can find it on there, and then through the usual channels. I think our Instagram is _design studio_. because we couldn't get Design Studio when we first tried to get it.
I think the website's got all the different locations, hasn't it? All the information for you.
Yeah. It's got all the studios on there. So New York, London, Sydney, and our team in Shanghai as well.
If anybody can't find James on LinkedIn, just let me know and I'll drop you a message and connect you together. And like I say, have a great weekend, mate. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll catch up again soon.
Sounds lovely. Cheers, Chris.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks. Speak soon.